The wall exploded into dust before Laura Whitfield even heard the shot. She dropped to the ground on instinct, her ears ringing, her heart slamming against her ribs. 3 feet away, a man twice her size was already down, clutching his shoulder, his face pale under the dirt and sweat. His name was Daniel Hart, and until 60 seconds ago he had been the calmest person in the room. Laura was not a soldier. She had no rank, no weapon, no training in how to survive a night like this one. She was a translator, brought along because she spoke the local language fluently, and the mission needed her ears more than it needed another rifle. She had spent the last 8 months learning the rhythm of this team, the way they moved together without speaking, the quiet jokes Daniel made to keep everyone loose before things got tense. None of that had prepared her for this moment, crouched behind broken concrete with gunfire cutting through the dark from somewhere above. The operation was supposed to be simple. Get in, confirm a name, get out before the sun rose. Nothing about it had gone the way it was planned. A rooftop that nobody had marked on the map had opened fire the second the team crossed into the courtyard, and now the whole plan had collapsed into noise and confusion and the sharp, bitter smell of smoke. Daniel tried to push himself up and failed, his arm refusing to hold his weight. Laura could see the pain crossing his face, quick and sharp, though he didn't make a sound. That silence scared her more than any scream could have. She had watched him carry heavier men across longer distances without breaking a sweat. Seeing him struggle to sit upright told her everything about how bad this had become. Another round cracked against the wall above them, close enough that she felt the air move. She looked toward the 2 men closest to her, both flattened against the rubble, both trying to find an angle to return fire without exposing themselves. Nobody had time to reach Daniel, nobody except her. She did not remember deciding to move. 1 second she was frozen behind the wall, and the next she was already crawling toward him, low and fast, the way she had seen the team do it 100 times without ever imagining she would do it herself. Daniel's eyes widened when he saw her coming. "Get back," he said, his voice rough. "Don't be stupid." She ignored him. She reached his side and pressed herself against him, putting her body between his and the open line from the rooftop. It was not a plan. It was not even a thought. It was just something her body decided to do before her mind could argue with it. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the sound of her own breathing and the pounding of her pulse in her throat. She could hear Daniel telling her to move, to get away, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite fear either. She stayed where she was. A shot hit the wall inches from where her head had been a second earlier, sending chips of stone across her shoulder. She flinched but did not move away. Behind her, she heard boots against gravel, fast and certain, and then hands were pulling both of them back around the corner, out of the open line, into the shadow of a half-collapsed building. It happened so quickly that Laura barely understood it was over until she was sitting with her back against cold stone, her hands shaking, Daniel beside her with a medic already working on his shoulder. The gunfire from the rooftop stopped soon after, silenced by 2 men who had circled around while everyone else held the line. The mission, somehow, was not a total loss. The source they had come for was already safe, already moving toward the extraction point. What remained was getting everyone else out alive. Nobody spoke much on the walk back to the vehicles. That was normal for this team, Laura had learned. They didn't process things out loud, not right after, not when adrenaline was still running hot through their veins. She assumed the silence meant nothing in particular. She was wrong. The flight back was long and quiet, filled with the low hum of engines and the occasional creak of metal. Daniel sat across from her, his arm now properly bandaged, his eyes closed but his breathing steady. She studied his face in the dim light, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to convince herself that she had only done what anyone would have done in her position. She was not sure that was true. When they landed, she expected to be debriefed, questioned, maybe even reprimanded for putting herself in danger without authorization. Instead, she was told to rest, that everything would be sorted out in the morning. She went to her small room in the safe house, showered until the smell of smoke was gone from her skin, and lay awake staring at the ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled her under. She woke before dawn to the sound of voices outside her door. Low voices, calm and unhurried, the kind of voices that belonged to people who had spent years learning how to stay quiet even when they had something important to say. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. She sat up, listened harder, and realized the voices were real, and there were a lot of them. She opened the door slowly, unsure of what she would find. The hallway was full. Seven men stood shoulder to shoulder, spilling out into the small courtyard beyond, more than she could count at first glance. Some she recognized from her own team. Others she had never seen before. Faces she didn't know. Patches on their uniforms from units she hadn't worked with. Every single one of them turned to look at her when the door opened. Her first thought was that something had gone wrong, that she was about to be told bad news. Her stomach dropped as she searched their faces for some sign of what was happening. What she found instead was something she hadn't expected at all. One of the older men stepped forward first, a team leader she recognized but had barely spoken to before that night. He had a quiet strength about him, the kind that came from decades of doing difficult work without needing anyone to notice. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Word travels fast around here," he said, "when someone does something like what you did." Laura didn't know how to respond. She hadn't told anyone the details of what happened on the rooftop. She assumed Daniel had, in his own quiet way. Once he was safely back and stitched up, she looked past the older man at the rest of the group, 18 of them by her count, standing in the pale light before sunrise. None of them saying much, all of them simply there. Nobody explained exactly why they had come. Nobody needed to. She understood, slowly. That word had spread through the base overnight, passed quietly from one person to another, the way important things often are among people who don't waste words. A translator with no weapon and no training had placed herself between a wounded operator and a line of fire, and by morning, every team in the compound had heard about it. One by one, they said very little, but their presence said everything. A young operator she had never met set a cup of coffee on the small table outside her door, steady and full, not a drop spilled, and walked away without saying a word. Another gave her a short nod, the kind reserved for someone who had earned a place among them. Daniel appeared last, his arm in a sling, moving slower than usual but still carrying that same calm humor in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, standing close enough that only she could hear him. "I know," she answered. "Then why did you?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment before answering honestly. "I didn't decide to," she said. "I just did." He smiled at that, the first real smile she had seen from him since the mission began. "That's the only kind of decision that matters out here," he told her. The crowd began to thin as the sun came up fully, men returning to their own routines, their own units, their own quiet mornings. But something had shifted, something Laura could feel, even if she couldn't put it into words. She was no longer just the translator attached to the team for a few months. She had become something else in their eyes, something earned rather than given. In the weeks that followed, she noticed small changes. She was included in briefings she wouldn't have been invited to before. Team members who had once been polite but distant now spoke to her freely, asked her opinion, trusted her judgment beyond just her language skills. She never asked for any of it, and she never brought up that night unless someone else did first. Daniel's shoulder healed slowly but completely. 1 month later, when her time with the unit came to an end and she prepared to leave for a new assignment far from the base, he found her packing her things and handed her something small wrapped in cloth. Inside was a simple enamel mug, slightly dented on one side, the same kind that had appeared outside her door that morning. "Figured you should have the real thing," he said, "not just the coffee." She kept that mug for years afterward, long after she left government work behind for a quieter life. It sat on her kitchen counter, through every home she lived in, a small, unremarkable object that meant more to her than most of the medals and certificates she had collected along the way. It reminded her of a night when fear had nearly frozen her in place, and of the choice she made anyway, without thinking, without hesitation, simply because someone she cared about needed her to. It also reminded her of a morning she would never forget, when 18 strangers and friends alike stood outside her door before sunrise, not to ask anything of her, but to make sure she understood that what she had done had not gone unnoticed. In a world built on strength and training and years of hard-earned skill, they had decided, without a single vote or announcement, that courage didn't require a uniform to be recognized. It only required someone willing to stand in the gap when it mattered most. Laura never went looking for recognition after that night, and she never needed to. The story followed her quietly for the rest of her career, told in low voices among people who valued actions far more than words, passed from one new recruit to another as a reminder that the bravest choices are often the ones made in a single heartbeat, without any plan at all.